This is Mike Tatarsky, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City. If you travel around rural parts of Vietnam, you may notice that farms tend to be small, often family-run affairs, far different from the vast industrial operations of the United States or other markets like Brazil. The data backs this up. According to the General Statistics Office, as of 2020, there were around 10 million smallholder farmers in Vietnam, though I've seen even higher estimates elsewhere. There isn't a universal definition of what qualifies as a smallholder, but the Food and Agriculture Organization defines them as, quote, small-scale farmers who manage areas varying from less than 1 hectare to 10 hectares. While this means more people have direct control over their farms, it also means many agricultural businesses don't have the access to capital or technology needed to compete on the international stage. This is especially challenging in an era where new environmental regulations, often spearheaded by the European Union, place demanding requirements on businesses in exchange for access to lucrative consumer markets. For example, the EU's new deforestation regulation, called EUDR, which goes into effect next year, requires agricultural producers to prove that their goods haven't been grown on recently deforested land. This is a noble goal, as land use change is a primary driver of global deforestation. But tracking such land use, in addition to generating other data relevant to farming, is difficult for, say, coffee farmers in the Central Highlands making a small living from harvest to harvest. So what can be done? Today's guest is Tiemann Swijdink, founder of both Coffee Trace and Lacàph Coffee. The first half of our conversation covers Coffee Trace, a new project aimed at providing a coffee farmer-centric EUDR data collection and traceability solution to both farmers and traders. We discussed the challenges farmers in Vietnam and other countries that export agricultural goods to the EU face in meeting new rules and what can be done to help, as well as the current turmoil in the international coffee bean market. Then, we talk about Lacàph's approach to working with coffee farmers, the increasingly high quality of Vietnamese coffee, misconceptions around robusta, the dominant coffee variety in Vietnam, and how the country may be well placed for a future in which climate change increasingly impacts global coffee production. As always, if you have any comments, feedback, or guest suggestions, get in touch at matatarsky@gmail.com. Let's get to my conversation with Tiemann. Tiemann, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Hey, Mike, how are you?
Yeah, not bad. Enjoying some rain finally after all those hot weeks.
Yeah, I'm sure we're going to talk about the rain, but because the drought is going to be a problem for the coffee crop next year. But I'm sure we'll be able to touch base on those kind of topics during this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. We will get to that. So you've got a couple businesses that you're involved with, but I actually wanted to start with Coffee Trace, which is about traceability and sustainability in the coffee supply chain in Vietnam, specifically, I guess, focusing on the EUDR, which is the European Union's deforestation regulation. So first of all, I was hoping you could kind of explain what EUDR is to listeners, and then also what you're hoping to achieve with Coffee Trace.
Yeah, so Coffee Trace is really the newest project within sort of my coffee entrepreneurship ventures, let's say. So Coffee Trace is really initially started before I knew about EUDR. So I'll talk about EUDR in a sec, but really originally it was born out of this realization that coffee farmers, there are a million coffee farmers in Vietnam, right? A million individual coffee farms in Vietnam, and what I realized when I was working with them through Lacàph is really the issue that these coffee farmers were not connected with or not using technology really to help them with their coffee cultivation and improving, the cultivation, improving their, price transparency, knowing so that they, knowing what the market rates are and things like that. And you and I have probably a dozen apps on our phone that will help us with our day-to-day work. So it's pretty shocking that coffee farmers have absolutely nothing that help them. So Coffee Trace was really started with this idea: how can we put coffee farmers at the center of the sort of data collection and information and transparency efforts, right? And creating a link between end consumers globally, not just in EU, but everywhere, and where the coffee comes from originally. So really improving transparency by making, data collection at the farm level, really at the core of this product. And so when EUDR was passed about a year ago, I really decided to make that central to the product, to Coffee Trace, because we recognize that EUDR is a relatively new piece of legislation, which was really designed to mitigate consumption of commodity products in the EU that come from recently deforested lands. So that's really what EUDR is about. There's a snapshot. It's in December of 2020, and anything that was essentially any lands that have been deforested since December 2020 are considered recently deforested. And for that reason, any commodities in about 7 commodity categories, of which coffee and cocoa and palm oil are some of them, are no longer allowed to be imported into the EU. And so that is a great idea, but naturally, as many such legislations eventually roll out, the people that are the most impacted by these kind of efforts, although noble, are going to be often the poorest coffee farmers or farmers in general, because they do not have access to the sort of resources that the larger coffee farms in Latin America, for example, do have access to. And so really making sure that they continue to have access to the EU market is really important. And it's important to Vietnam because about 54% of Vietnamese green beans get exported to the EU at present. And it's important to their livelihoods, right? Ensuring that they continue to have access so that they don't get essentially put into a basket of non-compliant coffee, which, very likely will be cheaper than general market rate. So what I do predict is that ultimately there are going to be essentially 2 markets, right? The European Union, sort of certified coffee, EUDR certified coffee, and non-certified coffee. And anything that ultimately ends up in EU needs to be certified, even if it's not processed in the EU. So, for example, if it's processed in China and then redirected to the EU, then even that needs to be EUDR compliant. So a huge amount of coffee needs to be compliant now, and anything that's not naturally will be, demanding a lower market rate, and that's a problem for many coffee farmers. So, what Coffee Trace ultimately is trying to do is create a free solution for these coffee farmers to, become EUDR compliant, and that's core to that initial stage. But what we really do hope to do in the future is empower coffee farmers to do a lot more, right? Because we know exactly where the coffee farm is, they'll be able to access additional resources with, for example, weather patterns in their area, or suggestions for new coffee varietals, because we know where the coffee farm is. We know also what kind of soil types they're going to have, so we can say, okay, this type of soil will require this kind of would work best with these innovations in types of coffee that can be grown, right? So species and subspecies and subvarietals of coffee that can be grown in particular areas. So, or for example, that kind of fertilizer is very good for that kind of soil type. So there are many things that we can build on top of Coffee Trace, but initially it's really about traceability and trying to create transparency for consumers also to really know where their products are coming from.
And I mean, you mentioned some of the lack of tech with these farmers, and I guess at this point it's worth noting for listeners. I mean, you mentioned that there's 1 million coffee farmers, and Vietnam's farming sector as a whole, beyond coffee, is very smallholder based. If you travel around farming areas, there's not industrial farms like you would see in the U.S. or you mentioned South America. These are generally pretty small operations. So, as you say, they don't have many resources. Kind of beyond that, what are some of the other challenges when it comes to traceability?
Vietnam, out of probably most countries, I would say, maybe along with Brazil, has never been although it's the second largest producer, grower of coffee in the world, you rarely see in the grocery store shelves in the US or Europe coffee of Vietnam, right, on the packaging. It's usually hidden by many layers and many middlemen, so to speak. So you'll buy a let's say FMCG level style coffee like Folgers or something like that, and that might very well be from Vietnam, but it will not often say anything about Vietnam. It will often be blended with other countries' coffee and kind of mixed all together, and have no transparency towards where the coffee originally comes from, right? And consumers are becoming more and more demanding for knowing where coffee or any consumption from of their daily lives comes from. They want to know more and more about the products that they consume, and traceability is a significant part of that. And especially in the coffee sector, people do very much appreciate understanding where the coffee comes from. So, really creating that link between consumers and farmers is an amazing first step. The auditing process is also a big, fundamental part of EUDR and other environmental regulation programs that are affecting coffee. So, there's a lot of steps and a lot of people involved in the process, but because these coffee farmers have so few resources, it's important to make it cheap, if not free, for them to ensure that they can continue to sell to European markets. And so Coffee Trace is 100% free for the coffee farmers. And what we do is we're charging the buyers in Europe for downloading data sets. And so when they need to buy a particular batch of coffee, there will be a data set that's associated with that batch of coffee. And then they need to pay to download that data set so they can do their auditing steps with that data set. And so that's the basic business model. Now, we're not doing this to get rich overnight. This is not really a project that we saw, okay, there's going to be massive business opportunity in the first couple of years. We really think that there is a huge business opportunity here, but initially it's really ensuring that coffee farmers are treated equally. Let's say whether they're huge coffee farmers in Brazil or a coffee farmer with less than a hectare in Vietnam. We need to make sure that everybody remains capable of accessing very important market, and that's not only going to be applied to the EU, right? So the UK is already set to implement very similar legislation. I believe that's going to go into effect next year. And the United States and Japan and other developed economies are looking at very similar kind of legislation. So it starts with EUDR, but it's definitely not ending there.
Right. Yeah, I guess Europe usually, for better or worse, kind of leads the way on these sorts of things. So is EUDR already in effect, or is that later in the year?
So EUDR has been passed, and it's been but it will only affect shipments that enter the EU at the beginning of 2025. So it doesn't affect current shipments. That's why there's also a lot of issues with coffee pricing and things like that. It's one of the reasons. But people are trying to stock up because they're concerned about in the EU as well. People are trying to stock up because they're concerned whether there might be disruptions in coffee supply, so green coffee supply early next year. But that, along with the drought in Vietnam and hoarding that we've been reading about in the media, all of those issues are compounding coffee prices, and especially for robusta, it's been pretty crazy, and I think that the increase in the price of robusta is actually, in the long term, really a good thing, because robusta farmers really deserve to be making more money off of the coffee that they grow. And what I really do hope, though, is that some of this increased revenues on the farmer side is going to eventually translate to increased investments on the farm side as well. Because what I've really recognized is that as the closer you get to consumer, the way up investment goes, right? So beautiful cafes, $50,000 espresso machines and things like that. But then as you get to coffee roasting, the investment goes a bit down. And then as you go to coffee processing, investment goes further down. And then when you get to the farmer, often the investment is very low. And so we really hope that these revenues can eventually start going back into improving coffee quality, which is one of the things that Vietnam has done a tremendous job so far, is really improving its coffee quality. And that's something that we really hope will continue over the next couple decades.
And so you mentioned this sort of turmoil in the market, I think, especially with Robusta. Now, I know commodity pricing can maybe seem a bit esoteric at times, but this does have, of course, real impact. What are these? I mean, I know there's been drought also referenced in the Central Highlands, which will hopefully get some relief soon. I've seen articles, as you referenced. I think there was a Bloomberg one in recent weeks talking about Vietnamese farmers, some farmers allegedly hoarding their supply or even defaulting on some shipment contracts. I don't know how widespread that is, but of course it doesn't reflect very well if it's happening. But what's driving this turmoil?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, it's been long overdue. People are paying, on the green buyer side, probably not enough. I don't think that necessarily translates to Starbucks's cost of a cappuccino for consumers necessarily. Of course, there'll be some impact, but overall, it's really about the commodity prices at the green level, right? So at the green bean level, it's been for very, very long, especially on the robusta side, far too low, and farmers were making very, very little. So it was not really sustainable anyway. And so, I don't think that necessarily having that increase in price is a bad thing. I think that farmers do need to make more money. I hope, however, that there's going to be more stability in the price, right? We can't have prices increase double every year, right? And that would really create too much tension. So, if the price can stabilize a bit, then that's good. I hope that it'll drive more people to enjoy coffee at home as well, because, for those $6, you can make incredible, probably the world's best coffee, right? For a $6 investment per cup. So, while people are paying for somewhat mediocre coffee, maybe quite a lot, if you were to do it at home, you can buy very, very good coffee. So these are tough economic times. I think that EUDR, indeed, climate change and people trying to speculate with the market. That's what's been driving prices up, 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 But I think, we're already seeing cracks form. I just read this morning, about Robusta prices actually retreating a bit. And that could happen extremely fast because there is, quite a bit of inventory with farmers still. And I think that once that price starts coming down, people are going to be really willing to sell quickly because they don't want to be too much on the losing end of the downwards trend. So we'll see, but I don't think that it's over. I think that we'll see a couple of years of price instability in coffee specifically, but there's have been similar impacts in the cocoa industry as well.
Yeah, I've seen a bit about that too. So you mentioned coffee drinking coffee at home, which serves as a nice transition to your other, I guess, primary business. You're as co-founder of Lacàph Coffee, which I assume coffee fans listening to this from Vietnam will at least be familiar with. And I was looking at Lacàph's website, and it kind of talked about the importance of relationships with farmers. And of course, we've been talking about farmers. So how does the brand try to stand out, like in its relationship with farmers?
Yeah, so I mean, we tried to be quite transparent about where our coffee comes from. We even have little maps on our packaging to show specifically provinces and areas where the coffee is sourced from. And we try to tell the stories of the coffee farmers that we work with, right? That's actually really core to the Lacàph DNA, is really the marriage of a commodity product with the storytelling. That's what makes us unique. That's why a lot of the leading hospitality brands like to work with us, because they also want to be telling stories about Vietnam, right, with their guests. When a guest checks into Park Hyatt, they want to know more about Vietnam. Often they're here because they're curious about the country. And so, Vietnamese coffee is so interesting because when you learn about the story of Vietnamese coffee, you're really learning about this a story of Vietnam itself, right? When you learn about Vietnamese coffee, you can learn about Vietnamese agricultural policy, economic policy, history, ethnic groups, and different agricultural areas, highlands, lowlands, midlands, all this sort of stuff. So really, coffee is really a gateway to understand more about the country itself. And a lot of five-star hotels especially really like that. And so there have been keen to work with us to really spread that message and be able to communicate more, really tell more stories about Vietnam to their guests. So that's one of the core things that we've been particularly focused on, is this marriage of coffee and culture, Vietnamese coffee and Vietnamese culture, and being almost like an ambassador. We see ourselves to some extent, or not really ourselves, but we see our products as ambassadors of the country, so that also when we export, we export more and more. That when someone, for example, in Paris has Lacàph coffee, that they have a little taste of Vietnam as well.
And so, I mean, you mentioned exports and to other countries. I mean, I've noticed when I go back to visit the US now, it's true that you might not see Vietnamese coffee on the shelves of your average supermarket, but at a lot of cafes, it's not uncommon to see a Vietnamese coffee item. So it's become a little bit ubiquitous in some ways, I suppose, or at least maybe cities with Vietnamese communities, for example. But how has this kind of increased exposure impacted your business and your work?
Yeah, I mean, I've been living in Vietnam since 2007. And so when I moved here from Amsterdam, there were no Vietnamese restaurants in Amsterdam. At least, they only had, like in Chinatown, in one of the restaurants, a little section that was like Vietnamese food. And it was sort of some sort of localized version of Vietnamese cuisine. And that is totally changed, right? Vietnamese food is not everywhere in Amsterdam, but certainly a lot more available, right? There's like 5 minutes walk from my house, a Vietnamese restaurant, and there are like about 20 or 30. And Amsterdam's a small town, and it's also not unique. We have the same trend happening in Paris, in London, in New York, San Francisco, LA, as certainly also is Seoul, Tokyo. So Vietnamese cuisine is only starting to really gain gaining popularity globally, and Vietnamese coffee is a big part of that. And so, I wouldn't say that we started the business because of that trend, but certainly we recognize that trend, right? We saw this as an interesting trend, and we think that we can do something with it. And really, the idea was to try to create a premium Vietnamese coffee brand, on the consumer level still, but kind of on the premium consumer level. So something kind of similar to what Illy and Lavazza are to Italian coffee. That's what we're trying to do for Vietnamese coffee: high quality, no additives, no preservatives, no artificial flavorings, and things like that. But still very targeted towards consumers who love good food and drinking good things as well. So yeah, we're really seeing increased interest. We hired a wonderful export business development manager for the company only months ago, and he's been doing a tremendous job, building up our export network. We're very, very focused on North America this year. We think that there's obviously a massive, I believe about 2.5 million Vietnamese Americans, but also just generally Americans really want to try Vietnamese coffee. And so we see ourselves as a brand that doesn't really say, okay, we're for Vietnamese Americans or white Americans or Hispanic Americans. We're really for the whole world. Our slogan is "Coffee's for the Curious," and our mission is to share Vietnamese coffee and culture with curious people everywhere. So that's how we define our consumers.
And so you mentioned, wanting to share premium coffee, and we're also talking about kind of perceptions of Vietnamese products. So Vietnam is, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the vast majority of coffee produced here is robusta, whereas the two primary varieties are that and Arabica, which I know historically robusta has kind of been looked down upon, at least in some corners, as kind of more for instant coffee, like the type of stuff you'd get in a packet or something along those lines. So perhaps you could kind of describe what kind of beans Lacàph focuses on, but also what sort of changes you've seen and how maybe Robusta is perceived as Vietnamese coffee has become more popular.
Yeah, so I'm a Vietnamese coffee evangelist, obviously, and I'm a Robusta evangelist. So I'm not going to be, maybe in the majority here when it comes to the coffee industry. But I think personally that Robusta has, for partially deserved, partially undeserved, has a bad rep. So you're absolutely right. A lot of people look down on Robusta, and I think that it is in part because it's easier to grow, and so you can grow it at huge volumes without giving it too much care and attention. And because of that, and because it's so easy to grow, people don't necessarily give it the attention that it might benefit from otherwise. And for that reason, in part, it's sort of relegated to instant coffee and to cheap coffee, commodity coffee, and things like that. It's been sort of pushed in that corner. But in fact, if you do the same sort of care and attention to Arabica, you're going to have pretty bad Arabica as well. In fact, when I'm in Holland, I go to a kind of well-known grocery store there. You can get like a kilo of Arabica for like €8, right? And there's no way that that's going to be a good product, right? At €8, it's going to be a very, very ordinary coffee. And it says 100% Arabica. It really goes to show how brainwashed people have become, that is the trigger word for people. Oh, that must mean that it's good. It doesn't mean it's good. it doesn't mean anything at all. In fact, it just means that the variety of the coffee used is 100% Arabica. So, and if you spend, a lot of care and attention to the Robusta, just like with Arabica, you're going to have an exceptional coffee. So I think, farmers are starting to really understand this in Vietnam as well. And there are, more and more Robusta farmers that are really focusing on quality over quantity and sort of making that transition from a quantity focus, growing as much as you can, to a quality focus, with this idea that they're going to be able to break out of the commodity pricing category and really sell to brands like Lacàph and sell premium coffees. So Robusta has a long way to go before it's accepted in the global sort of coffee, especially on the specialty coffee side arena. But there are a lot of great people working on that issue, according, as like in the US, but also here in Vietnam. And we think that there's a very important future for Robusta. It's much more climate change resistant. So it'll be grown in many areas of the world more and more. Vietnam has a massive head start, obviously, but now, it's really about trying to change and transition Vietnam from a quantity to a quality producer. And I think that that's slow, but it is happening. Farmers are seeing, keeping an eye on each other, and they kind of see, oh, my neighbors made this transition a couple of years ago, and suddenly, they're being able to afford a lot more than before, and that's true, right? Usually, farmers are able to ask way more than they lose, let's say, in quantity. So they're actually better off in the long run making that transition most of the time. So it's exciting. I think that Robusta has a really important role to play in the coffee industry in the future. Also, hybrid varietals of Arabica Robusta that sort of try to pick kind of the best of both are going to be increasingly important. But, Vietnam is in a great position to take advantage of this. And I hope that we keep on investing in ensuring that the quality keeps on improving.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting about the climate change aspect, of course, because I've also read about how Robusta is more resilient, and I think there's another variety that's less common, but even more resilient than that. But I guess, where do you see? I mean, of course, nobody can predict the future, but how do you see climate change kind of impacting things here in the coming years? I mean, we've already talked about this drought in the Central Highlands, which, of course, that could become more frequent potentially. But yeah, I mean, how do you kind of view that through the business?
Well, one of the things I try to tell my colleagues often is, hey, everybody's going through the same situation. So it's not like our companies specifically being targeted with all these price increases, right? So as long as people enjoy drinking coffee and willing to pay for it, we'll have hopefully this business. As long as we can be competitive and innovative, we'll be able to continue operating, we hope. So yeah, I think, climate change is unfortunately only going to get worse for a while. And it's not entirely clear when people are going to figure out how to suck huge amounts of, greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere and recapture these. But there's no saying exactly. But I think, one of the things that we're lucky in that 95% of the coffee grown in Vietnam is already Robusta. So we're already in a position of strength in that sense. Will there be an impact? Absolutely. But I think that there are other countries, especially countries that are growing coffees at higher altitudes, that are going to have, more severe impact from climate change. That said, the recent drought that's just starting to maybe end this week will probably have some impact on the quantity of the coffee that can be harvested at the end of the year. So, I think that higher prices are here to stay. I don't think that in the coming 5 years we'll see very low prices again, but we'll see. It's a very difficult market to predict otherwise, and there are people that are much better at it than I am, I'm sure.
Kind of moving towards last question or two, where do you kind of hope to see Coffee Trace and Lacàph go maybe over the next couple of years or so?
Yeah, so Coffee Trace is a really new project. We have the software that runs on Android now in beta, and we're testing this more and more. And, we hope that we don't, even though the EUDR is really coming into full effect at the end of the year, or the beginning of next year, we don't see this as a EUDR specific project. We really see this as an idea to empower and coffee farmers and put them at the center of the sort of the coffee trace universe. And I really do hope that the app can help coffee farmers ultimately, to make sure that they have information about, that can help them, right? For example, it'll be very dry over the next month. You're going to have to increase your irrigation, or, hey, it's going to rain a lot next month. It's going to, you can probably start planning on how you're going to adjust your irrigation needs downwards. Access to both know-how resources, access to new coffee varietals, access to bio fertilizers, biochemicals, biopesticides. These sort of things are things that we'd love to do with Coffee Trace, is really adding additional products and services, both free and paid, depending on what the product is, to the app, so that coffee farmers are getting really connected with the world for the first time in this sort of Coffee Trace ecosystem, in that sense, right? Really specific for coffee. So that's the direction, but it's still very early days. Lacàph, we have a very simple vision. We see ourselves, we hope to see ourselves as the number one premium Vietnamese coffee brand in the world by the end of the decade. So that's our vision. We have a lot of work to do. We want to, become more and more available in North America, in Asia Pacific, and Europe. But we have been making massive steps. We are now available as a B2B brand in EU. Not yet for consumers. We're launching on Amazon in North America, and so we have a couple things in the works that's going to make our product more accessible to people all around the world. But yeah, that's ultimately what we see. We see ourselves a little bit as the future Illy of Vietnam, and that's what we're working on every day.
Nice. That's a noble, ambitious goal. And I actually, one final question. I should have asked this earlier, I think, but with EUDR and traceability, when you go to farmers or you have outreach, I don't want to make them sound ignorant, but if they don't have access to much tech, are they aware of these coming regulations, or is it clear to them what they need to do?
Yeah, so that's a big issue, right? Education around EUDR is one of the main reasons why EUDR is not getting the sort of attention that it needs. Almost, all the laws, all the regulations are published in every EU language, but not in the languages that the farmers can read, right? And so, yeah, that's a huge issue. So one of the ways that we're working is through sort of almost like a ambassadorship program. So it's essentially that we choose sort of farmers that are, important sort of influencers almost, right, in their communities, and we try to really get them on board first, and then we create a reward program that is, at least for the time being, it's non-monetary reward, but it's more like a recognition reward to help them, to get them to introduce the program to their communities. So it's kind of like it's almost like what you get, like gamifying, like what Google does with maps and stuff like that. And so that's hopefully, and we have a couple other strategies that we're employing, but yeah, education for coffee farmers, getting them to know why this is important, like, oh, this is so far away from where I am and things like that. And it's really ultimately like, okay, do they want to have their coffee belong to batch A or batch B? Batch A goes to anywhere at once, and batch B only can go to certain markets. And so obviously it's very important for them to be able to access any market, and so can compete with basically, any market can compete for their product. And that's really key.
Gotcha. Well, Tiemann, thanks so much for coming on the show today. I mean, a really good perspective, kind of from farm to coffee cup, more or less, which I know the first half of that is probably something a lot of people don't necessarily think about, maybe where the coffee comes from. Although more and more, as you say, people do care about that. So appreciate you coming on and talking through this.
Yeah, Mike, I appreciate it. And, I really love the podcast. I'm glad that you brought it back. And, the newsletter is really cool to read. So keep up the good work. And thank you for what you've been doing as well.
Thanks. I appreciate that. That's it for this week's episode of the Vietnam Weekly podcast. Connect with the Vietnam Weekly on Threads, LinkedIn, or Instagram. Thank you so much for listening, and please rate or review the show on your preferred podcast platform. See you next week.